New findings on the mysterious death of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Two gunmen rode into a Bolivian mining town in 1908. By dawn, two bodies lay in the dust. But whose? Were they the most wanted outlaws of the American West, or two nameless drifters caught in the wrong fight? Why were their graves never found? Why did witnesses vanish? And why, years later, did a man in America hint that he had been Butch Cassidy all along? The answers to these questions are not simple, and later in this video, you will discover why the story refuses to die. In early November 1908, two armed men were killed in the Bolivian mining town of San Vicente during a standoff with local authorities. Their identities were never conclusively established, and this uncertainty has remained one of the most debated mysteries of the American outlaw era. Some believe the dead men were Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Others argued they were unknown bandits who happened to be mistaken for the famous pair. San Vicente was a small settlement in the Bolivian highlands, located in a remote valley surrounded by tin and silver mines. The town existed largely to serve the mining companies and their workers, with a handful of stores, a cantina, and a small garrison of soldiers stationed nearby. By 1908, Bolivia was connected to global markets by railways and telegraph lines, but its mining camps still had the appearance and character of frontier outposts. Foreigners stood out quickly, and suspicious behavior was often reported to authorities. According to official accounts, the two men who arrived in San Vicente shortly before the incident were foreigners. They purchased supplies, paid with unfamiliar coins, and spoke poor Spanish. Their gear, saddles, bridles, and revolvers, was of North American design, which marked them immediately as outsiders. Reports suggest they were also cautious in their movements, avoiding social gatherings and showing unusual concern about local patrols and travel routes. At the time, Bolivia was on alert. Days earlier, a payroll robbery near Tupiza had drawn attention, and word spread quickly through the mining region. Telegraph stations allowed news of crimes to travel faster than ever before, and patrols were increasingly aggressive in pursuing armed suspects. When locals in San Vicente noticed that the two foreigners' mules bore brands linked to the Tupiza robbery, suspicions hardened. A message was sent to the authorities, and within hours, a detachment of soldiers and police surrounded the house where the men had taken lodging. Accounts of the standoff agree on the basic sequence of events. The authorities demanded surrender. The men inside responded with gunfire, killing at least one of the Bolivian soldiers and wounding another. The exchange of shots continued into the night. Witnesses recalled long pauses between gunfire, suggesting the men inside were rationing ammunition carefully. Around midnight, two final shots were heard in close succession, after which silence followed. At dawn, the soldiers entered the house. Inside they found two bodies. One man lay on the floor, dead from gunshot wounds. The other was found on the bed with a pistol nearby, and evidence suggested he had shot himself. The possessions recovered included North American currency, a knife, spurs, and a map. The weapons and gear were consistent with experienced riders and gunmen, but no official identification was made at the time. Bolivian authorities buried the bodies in unmarked graves in San Vicente. No photographs were taken before burial, and no fingerprints or other verifiable evidence were preserved. Later claims that the dead were Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid rested on circumstantial evidence and local testimony, not on forensic proof. Because of this, the San Vicente incident has remained one of the most disputed episodes in outlaw history. What the San Vicente shootout reveals is the difficulty of law enforcement and identification in remote regions during the early 20th century. Rumors traveled quickly, but reliable information was scarce. Armed foreigners in a mining town naturally drew suspicion. Once the gunfight occurred, the assumption that the men must be the famous American outlaws spread rapidly, and it fit the public desire for closure to a long and notorious criminal career. Yet the absence of clear documentation left room for doubt. The lack of photographs, the speed of burial, and the fact that no American investigators confirmed the bodies ensured that alternative theories would survive. To this day, historians weigh the San Vicente standoff as either the end of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or as the death of two unknown fugitives who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This unresolved identity is what makes the San Vicente incident so significant. It demonstrates how the frontier world, even in the early 20th century, still produced mysteries where legend and fact became inseparable. Later in this video, we will examine the official reports, conflicting timelines, and later claims to test whether San Vicente truly marked the final chapter of the Wild Bunch, or whether the outlaw legends managed to escape once more. Bolivian papers versus American reports, clashing timelines. The events in San Vicente quickly moved beyond the mining camp itself and became a subject of international reporting. Bolivian newspapers published accounts based on statements from the local military and police, while American newspapers, already familiar with the exploits of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, eagerly seized on the story. The result was two competing versions of the same event, each shaped by geography, language, and political context. In Bolivia, official reports described the San Vicente incident in straightforward terms. Two armed foreigners were involved in a payroll robbery near Tupiza, pursued by soldiers, and finally cornered in San Vicente. The Bolivian press accepted the authorities' conclusion that the men were the famous North American bandits, even though there was no definitive evidence beyond circumstantial clues such as their gear, their appearance, and their behavior. For local readers, the matter was settled. Bolivia's army had eliminated notorious international criminals. American reporting, however, painted a less certain picture. Within weeks of the San Vicente gunfight, newspapers in the United States published conflicting accounts. Some repeated the Bolivian version, presenting it as the long-awaited end of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Others questioned the story, pointing to the lack of photographic evidence, the absence of positive identification, and the speed with which the bodies had been buried. In the American press, the story quickly became less about two dead men in Bolivia and more about whether the outlaw legends had truly reached their conclusion. Timing also played a role in the confusion. The telegraph allowed for rapid transmission of information, but international communication in 1908 was still uneven. Reports from Bolivia reached the United States through translation and often passed through multiple sources before publication. Small details were altered, exaggerated, or lost altogether. American readers often saw different names for the same town, varying accounts of the number of shots fired, or inconsistent descriptions of the men's possessions. This inconsistency left ample room for doubt. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, which had pursued Butch Cassidy and his gang for years, monitored the reports closely. The agency had long believed that Cassidy and Sundance were active in South America, but even the Pinkertons could not verify the Bolivian accounts. Their files reflected the same uncertainty as the press. The outlaws may have died in San Vicente, or they may have escaped. It is important to note the role of reputation in shaping these narratives. By 1908, Cassidy and Sundance were already international figures, and their story attracted far more attention than that of ordinary bandits. Bolivian authorities had a strong incentive to claim credit for eliminating them, as doing so emphasized the effectiveness of local law enforcement and placed Bolivia in world headlines. American newspapers, for their part, had long relied on the outlaw stories to sell papers, and the San Vicente incident provided another opportunity to engage readers, whether the story was verified or not. The result was two bodies in a Bolivian grave and two competing histories. In Bolivia, certainty prevailed. The famous bandits had been killed. In the United States, ambiguity prevailed. The famous bandits might have been killed, or they might have escaped. This division in reporting set the stage for more than a century of speculation, eyewitness claims, and alternative theories that continue to surround the San Vicente shootout. The clash between Bolivian and American reports reveals the larger problem of outlaw history in the early 20th century. In an age without standardized identification methods, without international coordination, and without photographic proof, narratives often became more important than evidence. Later in this video, we will turn to the burial and exhumation controversies, where the absence of reliable physical proof created even deeper uncertainty. The burial question, graves moved, names missing. The San Vicente shootout ended with two bodies. That much is certain. Yet what happened to those bodies after the standoff is one of the most problematic aspects of the story. Unlike in the American West, where lawmen often photographed outlaws and displayed their remains as proof of success, the Bolivian authorities did not leave clear evidence. Instead, the burials were carried out quickly, in local ground, and without the kind of records that later historians would desperately search for. This absence of reliable burial documentation is not a minor detail. It has been at the center of the controversy for more than a century. If Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were killed in San Vicente, then their graves should still exist, or at least be identifiable. If the graves cannot be found or confirmed, the possibility remains open that the story of their deaths was mistaken or deliberately misrepresented. The official Bolivian account stated that the two men were buried in the local cemetery at San Vicente. In 1908, the cemetery was small, little more than a collection of simple marked and unmarked graves used by mining families. Records were minimal, and headstones often crude or temporary. Unlike cemeteries in larger cities such as La Paz or Potosí, where church registries might note burials, San Vicente's graveyard lacked formal record-keeping. The bodies were placed in unmarked graves, a common practice in small settlements where resources and attention were limited. From the beginning, the burials left questions. Contemporary American reports noted that no effort was made to preserve photographs, fingerprints, or other identifiers before the men were placed in the ground. Some newspapers even remarked on the unusual haste of the burial, given the supposed importance of the outlaws. For Bolivian authorities, however, the case may have seemed closed the moment the shooting stopped. The men were foreigners, identified loosely as the outlaws already rumored to be in the area. Once they were dead, the practical need was to remove the bodies and restore order, not to prove their names for posterity. Over the decades that followed, attempts to locate the graves became increasingly complicated. San Vicente itself changed as mining expanded. The cemetery shifted locations more than once, with graves being moved or disturbed during construction and industrial development. Mining towns were not built for permanence. They rose quickly when ore was found and often declined just as quickly when the ore ran out. In such places, graveyards were sometimes relocated without precision and markers were lost. By the mid-20th century, local residents were no longer sure where the original 1908 cemetery had been. One of the most significant efforts to solve the burial mystery came in 1991, when a team of American and Bolivian researchers conducted an excavation in San Vicente. The project aimed to recover the remains of the two supposed outlaws and confirm their identity through modern forensic methods. Excavations uncovered skeletal remains believed to belong to one of the men killed in 1908. However, DNA testing later compared the sample to known relatives of the Parker family, Butch Cassidy's family line, and found no genetic match. This result did not close the debate. Instead, it deepened it. Some argued that the wrong grave had been exhumed, given the uncertainties about the original cemetery location. Others claimed the result proved that the dead in San Vicente were not Cassidy and Sundance. The 1991 excavation highlighted another problem: the reliance on local memory. Oral accounts from San Vicente residents had been used to guide the excavation, but nearly a century had passed since the shootout. Families remembered stories told by parents and grandparents, but such memories inevitably blurred with time. One resident might point to a certain section of ground, convinced that the bodies had been placed there. Another might insist on a different spot. Without written records or photographs, archaeologists were left with guesswork and conflicting testimony. Complicating the matter further, historians discovered inconsistencies in Bolivian archival material. Some reports claimed the bodies had been buried together, others said separately. A few suggested the graves had been disturbed not long after the burials, perhaps when new mining shafts were dug. There were even claims that bones had been removed decades later by treasure hunters who believed valuables might have been buried with the Americans. Each inconsistency weakened the reliability of the burial story. This lack of certainty fed directly into the survival theories. If the graves could not be located, skeptics argued, then perhaps there had been no graves at all. Perhaps the men killed at San Vicente were not Cassidy and Sundance, but two lesser-known bandits. Perhaps the real outlaws escaped and lived under new names. In this way, the missing or misplaced graves became one of the strongest pillars supporting the legend that Cassidy and Sundance survived Bolivia. It is also worth noting that burial practices in rural South America at the time differed from those familiar to Americans. Quick burials without markers were common. Families of miners often lacked the money for headstones. Graves were sometimes reused, with older remains displaced to make room for new ones. These realities make the loss of Cassidy and Sundance's supposed resting places less surprising, but they also make historical verification nearly impossible. In the end, the burial question remains unresolved. The only firm facts are that 2 bodies were placed in the ground at San Vicente in 1908, and that later attempts to identify them have failed to provide conclusive answers. What should have been the simplest element, the location of a grave, has become one of the most confusing and contested pieces of the story. The missing graves turned a straightforward shootout into a mystery that refuses to die. If the bodies cannot be proven, the legends cannot be buried either. And that uncertainty shaped everything that followed. The rumors of survival, the supposed sightings, and the enduring fascination with what happened after San Vicente. Later in this video, we will turn to the disappearance of Etta Place, whose own vanishing act fueled speculation that Cassidy and Sundance not only survived, but perhaps continued their lives far from the Bolivian mountains. Etta Place vanishes, sightings that fuel survival talk. The story of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid cannot be told without mentioning Etta Place, one of the most mysterious women of the outlaw era. Her disappearance after 1908 became another strand in the web of uncertainty surrounding San Vicente. Unlike the graves in Bolivia, which remain a physical mystery, Etta's story is a mystery of silence. She simply vanished from the record. That absence gave rise to speculation that she might have known the truth about what really happened to Cassidy and Sundance, and that her disappearance was deliberate. What we know about Etta Place is remarkably limited. Even her birth name and origin remain uncertain. Some accounts suggest she was a schoolteacher or nurse from the American East. Others say she came from Texas or possibly even Europe. What is documented is her close relationship with Harry Longabout, better known as the Sundance Kid. She traveled with him and Butch Cassidy to South America in 1901, where they attempted to build new lives in Argentina's Santa Cruz province. Together they bought a ranch near Cholila, posing as respectable settlers. The 3 lived quietly for several years, blending into the frontier community. Local records confirm land purchases made under their assumed names, and photographs from the period show Etta with Cassidy and Sundance. By all accounts, she was strikingly attractive, well-dressed, and fluent in both English and Spanish. She seemed capable of moving between cultures, a valuable skill in a land where Americans were still rare. Her trail becomes most visible in 1904, when she traveled with Sundance to New York. From there, they sailed to Buenos Aires, and she continued with him back into the Argentine interior. But within a few years, as the authorities closed in on Cassidy and Sundance following robberies in Argentina and Chile, Etta's presence fades from the record. By 1907 or 1908, she was no longer with them. Whether she left voluntarily, was sent away for her safety, or disappeared for other reasons has never been established. The timing of her disappearance is critical. If Etta parted from Sundance before the San Vicente shootout, then she had no connection to the final chapter. But if she remained with him longer, as some unverified reports suggest, she may have known whether the men killed in Bolivia were truly Cassidy and Sundance, or whether they escaped. This gap has been exploited by survival theories ever since. Several alleged sightings of Etta Place surfaced in the years following 1908. In 1909, American newspapers reported that she had been seen in Denver, though the accounts were vague and lacked evidence. Later reports placed her in Texas, in Chile, and even in Paris. None of these sightings were confirmed, but each kept her name alive in the press. The mere possibility that she survived and returned to the United States encouraged the idea that Cassidy and Sundance might have done the same. One of the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence connecting her disappearance to the survival theories came from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The Pinkertons had monitored Etta Place closely during her years with Cassidy and Sundance. Their files included detailed descriptions and photographs, which were rare for women associated with outlaw gangs. Yet after 1907, the Pinkertons admitted they lost track of her completely. For an agency famous for its persistence, this was unusual. The lack of further intelligence suggested either that Etta took great care to disappear or that she had inside help. Historians have debated whether she might have returned quietly to the United States under her real identity, living out her life far from the public eye. If so, She would have been one of the few figures connected to the Wild Bunch to escape both law enforcement and legend. Others believe she may have died young, either in South America or soon after returning to North America, leaving no trace in official records. What keeps the speculation alive is the fact that her disappearance coincides with the period when Cassidy and Sundance were supposedly at their end in Bolivia. If she had left them earlier, why was her absence not noticed until much later? If she left them later, then why did no authority ever question her about their fate? The silence suggests she knew more than she revealed, and possibly that she was removed from the story deliberately. In the broader context of outlaw history, Etta Place stands out because she is not a caricature or a legend inflated by dime novels. The records that do exist show a real woman, educated, well-traveled, and directly tied to two of the most famous outlaws of her time. Her vanishing act is therefore harder to dismiss. It is not just another rumor. It is a documented absence where records should exist. Her story matters for another reason. The mystery of San Vicente is often presented as a question of forensic evidence, bodies, graves, and DNA. But Etta Place represents the human side of the mystery. If she survived, she may have carried the truth about Cassidy and Sundance with her. If she vanished intentionally, it may have been because the truth was inconvenient or dangerous. Ultimately, Etta Place's disappearance remains one of the strongest supports for the belief that Cassidy and Sundance did not die in Bolivia. Without her, the survival theories would rely only on vague reports and questionable evidence. With her, they gain a credible figure whose silence and absence raise questions that have never been answered. What became of Etta Place remains unknown. No verified death record has ever been found. No confirmed grave has been identified. Her trail simply ends, and in its place a century of speculation has grown. Was she a witness to the end of the Wild Bunch, or did she live out her years knowing the story was not over? Later in this video, we will turn to the Pinkerton Detective Agency itself, whose pursuit of Cassidy and Sundance shaped much of the legend and whose motives for closing the case may explain why uncertainty was allowed to persist. Pinkertons want closure, pressure, payoffs, and motives. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency played a central role in the pursuit of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. By the early 20th century, the Pinkertons were no longer just a private security firm. They had become a quasi-official law enforcement arm for banks, railroads, and corporations. When Cassidy and Sundance continued their criminal activities in South America, the Pinkertons followed them across borders. Understanding the agency's role is essential to understanding how the story of San Vicente was shaped and why so many people believed, or wanted to believe, that the Outlaws died in Bolivia in 1908. The Pinkertons' interest in Cassidy and Sundance began in the United States during the 1890s. The Wild Bunch, under Cassidy's leadership, had become one of the most successful outlaw groups in the West, responsible for multiple train and bank robberies. Railroads, which were among the Pinkertons' most important clients, demanded that the agency put an end to the gang's activities. By 1901, the Pinkertons had compiled extensive files on Cassidy, Sundance, and their associates, including photographs, physical descriptions, and personal histories. When Cassidy and Sundance fled to South America, the Pinkertons did not abandon the chase. Reports in the agency's archives confirmed that they tracked the pair to Argentina, where the Outlaws purchased a ranch under assumed names. Local authorities were supplied with descriptions, and the Pinkertons monitored movements in Buenos Aires and Patagonia. After a series of robberies in the region were linked to American bandits, the Pinkertons increased their pressure, warning officials in both Argentina and Chile that the two fugitives posed a threat to financial institutions. By the time of the San Vicente shootout in 1908, the Pinkertons had been chasing Cassidy and Sundance for more than a decade. The agency had expended money, manpower, and reputation in the pursuit. It is important to recognize that the Pinkertons operated not only as detectives, but as a business. Their reputation depended on results. Closing the file on Cassidy and Sundance with a confirmed death would have allowed the agency to declare victory to its clients and to the public. Yet here lies the problem. The San Vicente case did not provide clear proof. The Bolivian reports identified the two dead men as Cassidy and Sundance, but the identification was based on assumption, not forensic evidence. The Pinkertons, despite their access to international channels, never produced independent verification. Their files after 1908 reflected uncertainty. Some agents accepted the Bolivian account at face value. Others admitted privately that doubt remained. Why, then, did the narrative of San Vicente as the end of Cassidy and Sundance become so widely accepted? Part of the answer lies in institutional motive. The Pinkertons, along with banks and railroads, had every reason to present the case as closed. Declaring the Outlaws dead reassured clients that the threat was over and reinforced the agency's reputation for effectiveness. At a time when newspapers still portrayed Cassidy and Sundance as folk heroes in some circles, the Pinkertons could not afford to appear incapable of ending their careers. The agency's relationship with the press also influenced the outcome. The Pinkertons were adept at using newspapers to shape public perception. They often released statements to journalists that emphasized their successes and minimized their failures. In the case of San Vicente, American newspapers eagerly repeated the Bolivian claim of the Outlaws' deaths, often citing the Pinkertons as confirmation. In reality, the agency had no more direct evidence than anyone else, but its authority gave the story credibility. It is also worth noting the political context. By 1908, the United States was projecting influence into Latin America through both diplomacy and business interests. American companies invested heavily in railroads, mining, and banking in South America. The presence of American outlaws threatening those industries was an embarrassment. Declaring Cassidy and Sundance dead in Bolivia conveniently removed that problem from the international stage. The Pinkertons, working closely with corporate clients, fit neatly into this context. Historians who have examined the Pinkerton files note the lack of closure. Internal reports sometimes contradict public statements. Some agents speculated that Cassidy and Sundance might still be alive after 1908. Others pointed to supposed sightings in Chile, Argentina, and even the United States. Yet none of this uncertainty was presented to the public. Instead, the agency allowed the narrative of their deaths to stand unchallenged. This silence served an obvious purpose. For the Pinkertons, keeping the legend alive did not benefit them. Allowing survival theories to flourish would only make the agency look ineffective. A closed case, 2 dead men in Bolivia, was easier to defend to clients, regardless of lingering doubts. The role of the Pinkertons in shaping the San Vicente story highlights an important truth about outlaw history. Law enforcement agencies, like newspapers, had their own motives for framing events in a certain way. The absence of evidence was less important than the appearance of resolution. What mattered was that the story ended in a way that satisfied clients, reassured the public, and preserved reputations. This raises a question. Did the Pinkertons genuinely believe Cassidy and Sundance died at San Vicente, or did they simply find it convenient to accept the claim? Without access to new evidence, the answer may never be known. But what can be said is this. The agency's willingness to endorse the Bolivian account without conclusive proof was not unusual for the time. In the early 20th century, law enforcement often relied on rumor and assumption, especially in cases that crossed international borders. In the larger narrative, the Pinkertons provided the authority that made the San Vicente story believable. Without their implicit endorsement, American newspapers might have treated the Bolivian reports with greater skepticism. With it, the legend of the Wild Bunch appeared to reach its end. And yet, the lack of proof left space for doubt, and in that space grew the survival theories that continue today. Later in this video, we will turn to one of the most intriguing of those theories, the case of William T. Phillips, a man who claimed in later years to be none other than Butch Cassidy himself. The William T. Phillips puzzle. Was he Butch? Few episodes in the long debate over Butch Cassidy's fate have stirred as much controversy as the claims surrounding William Thaddeus Phillips, an otherwise obscure man from the American Northwest. In the 1920s, Phillips began circulating stories about the Wild Bunch, eventually writing a manuscript in which he suggested, though never directly stated, that he himself had been Butch Cassidy. The puzzle of Phillips is central to the survival theory. If his claims contained truth, then Cassidy did not die in Bolivia in 1908. If they did not, then Phillips was either a fraud or a man fascinated by an outlaw he never met. Phillips appeared in Spokane, Washington, in the early 20th century. He worked in construction and occasionally wrote fiction. By the 1920s, he had taken an interest in outlaw history, specifically the story of the Wild Bunch. His knowledge of the gang was detailed, and he claimed access to information not available in the press. This alone caught the attention of researchers. At a time when few records about Cassidy and Sundance were widely published, Phillips seemed to know personal details about their movements, habits, and associates. In 1934, Phillips self-published a manuscript titled The Bandit Invincible, the story of Butch Cassidy. The work read partly as biography, partly as personal memoir. In it, Phillips described Cassidy's early life, his career as an outlaw, and his supposed escape from Bolivia. The most striking aspect of the book was its tone. Phillips wrote as though he were Cassidy himself, while never outright confessing it. Readers were left with the impression that Phillips and Cassidy were one and the same, though Phillips stopped short of a direct admission. Why would a man write such a book? There are several possibilities. The first is that Phillips really was Butch Cassidy, living under an assumed name after returning quietly to the United States. If this were true, the San Vicente shootout must have involved two other men who were mistakenly identified. Phillips's manuscript, which describes Cassidy surviving Bolivia, appears to support this version. The second possibility is that Phillips had known Cassidy personally in earlier years. This might explain his detailed knowledge of the outlaw's life, while also accounting for the inconsistencies in his narrative. He may have written The Bandit Invincible as a kind of tribute or as an attempt to profit from the legend by implying he was Cassidy himself. The third possibility is fraud. Phillips may have gathered what information he could from newspapers, stories, and local legends, and then presented it in a way that made him seem like Cassidy. In this view, the book was a fabrication designed to attract attention. Evidence for and against the Phillips as Cassidy theory has been debated for decades. Supporters point to his detailed knowledge of Wild Bunch history, much of it not widely known in the 1920s and 1930s. They argue that only someone who had lived those events could have described them so convincingly. Critics respond that Phillips often made errors, confusing dates, exaggerating events, or presenting information that contradicted established facts. Such mistakes, they argue, point to secondhand knowledge rather than firsthand experience. Physical evidence complicates the picture further. Photographs of William T. Phillips have been compared to known images of Butch Cassidy. Some observers note a resemblance in facial features, particularly in the shape of the nose and jawline. Others argue the differences are too great to support identification. Handwriting analysis has also been attempted, comparing Phillips's writing to known Cassidy letters, but the results have been inconclusive. An additional layer of intrigue came from Phillips's wife, who reportedly admitted after his death in 1937 that he had been Cassidy. According to this version, she confirmed privately what Phillips had only implied publicly. Critics question the reliability of such testimony, pointing out that personal motives, financial, reputational, or emotional, may have shaped the claim. Historians examining the Phillips manuscript often note its inconsistencies. For example, the book claims Cassidy underwent surgery to alter his appearance, a detail found in no other source. It also suggests that Cassidy lived peacefully in the Northwest for decades, a convenient narrative but one difficult to verify. Supporters argue that the errors could be deliberate misdirections designed to conceal surviving associates. Detractors see them as evidence of invention. What is certain is that Phillips's claims revived interest in Cassidy's survival at a time when the San Vicente story had largely been accepted. Newspapers across the United States reported on the manuscript, and the idea of Cassidy returning home under an alias became a staple of survival theories. The fact that Phillips never openly admitted his identity only added to the mystique. From a historical perspective, the Phillips puzzle illustrates the challenges of outlaw history in the absence of verifiable records. When a man with knowledge and motive makes claims that cannot be easily disproven, the result is lasting controversy. The debate over Phillips has continued for nearly a century, with new analyses appearing even in recent decades as historians re-examine photographs, handwriting, and testimony. Whether Phillips was Cassidy, a friend of Cassidy, or simply a fraud, his story reinforced the idea that San Vicente was not the end. By publishing his account, Phillips ensured that the possibility of Cassidy's survival would remain alive in public imagination. The William T. Phillips case also highlights the broader appeal of survival legends. Audiences prefer mysteries that remain open-ended. A A shootout in a remote Bolivian mining town, with quick burials and no proof, left space for speculation. A mysterious man in the American Northwest, writing as if he were the outlaw himself, filled that space perfectly. Ultimately, the Phillips puzzle cannot be resolved with certainty. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, compelling but inconsistent. What it demonstrates most clearly is how the absence of final proof in Bolivia allowed competing narratives to flourish in the decades that followed. In the next section, we will examine the modern era of investigation, photographs, scars, and DNA evidence that has attempted to close the case with science, yet has only deepened the mystery of whether Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid truly met their end at San Vicente. Photographs, scars, and DNA, evidence that refuses to settle. In modern times, investigators have turned to science in hopes of resolving the century-old mystery of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Where newspapers, lawmen, and memoirs have left contradictions, researchers have sought proof in photographs, medical details, and DNA testing. Yet each attempt to close the case has instead kept the debate alive. The earliest efforts to confirm the San Vicente deaths relied on visual recognition. Cassidy and Sundance were well known in the United States. Their photographs had circulated in wanted posters as early as the 1890s. Witnesses in Bolivia described the two dead men as light-skinned foreigners who matched those images, but no photographs of the San Vicente bodies were ever taken. This absence of photographic evidence is one of the most glaring weaknesses in the official account. In the American West, dead outlaws were routinely photographed to prove identity and discourage rumor. The fact that no such images exist from Bolivia allowed speculation to flourish. Over the years, historians have tried to compare photographs of known associates with suspected later images of Cassidy or Sundance living under assumed identities. One of the most famous comparisons involved William T. Phillips, the man some believe to be Cassidy. Side-by-side analysis of facial features, particularly the nose, jawline, and ears, produced arguments both for and against the identification. While modern facial recognition software has been applied in some cases, the quality of the surviving photographs is too poor to yield a definitive answer. Medical details provide another line of inquiry. Cassidy was known to have distinctive scars, including injuries from past gunfights and accidents. In theory, examining the remains in San Vicente should have confirmed whether the bodies matched those descriptions. However, when archaeologists exhumed remains in 1991 from what was believed to be the San Vicente Cemetery, no such conclusive evidence was found. Skeletal remains were recovered, but they did not clearly match Cassidy's known injuries. This created more questions than answers. The most significant attempt to use science came with DNA testing. In the 1991 excavation, researchers hoped to extract DNA from the remains and compare it with living relatives of the Parker family, Cassidy's kin. Initial testing suggested no match. At first glance, this seemed to disprove the San Vicente story. But critics of the excavation quickly pointed out the weaknesses of the study. The location of the original 1908 cemetery had shifted multiple times due to mining development, and local residents could not agree on the precise burial sites. The bones tested may not have been those of the outlaws at all. In addition, DNA technology at the time was less advanced than it is today, leaving room for error or contamination. Subsequent efforts to repeat the DNA analysis have been attempted, but with limited success. No confirmed remains of Cassidy or Sundance have been recovered that can be definitively tied to San Vicente. Without a proven sample, comparison with family DNA cannot yield certainty. Thus, the scientific approach has so far failed to close the question. What these attempts have shown, however, is how difficult it is to apply modern forensic tools to century-old mysteries. Graves may have been disturbed. Records may be incomplete or lost. Witness testimony, once central to identification, cannot be re-evaluated with certainty. Even the most advanced technology cannot produce answers if the basic evidence, verified remains, is missing. Despite these challenges, the pursuit of scientific proof continues. Some researchers argue that new excavations in San Vicente, guided by improved archaeological methods, could recover the correct graves. Others believe the answer lies not in Bolivia but in the United States, where descendants and family lore suggest Cassidy may have returned under a false name. In that case, DNA from suspected graves in the American West might one day provide a match. What is most striking is that every scientific attempt has reinforced the same outcome: uncertainty. The absence of photographs prevents visual confirmation. The absence of clear medical markers prevents anatomical confirmation. The inconclusive DNA prevents genetic confirmation. Each gap leaves the mystery unresolved, and each attempt that fails only strengthens the legend. The persistence of this uncertainty has cultural as well as historical significance. The story of Cassidy and Sundance has endured not only because of their crimes, but because of the unresolved ending. Definitive proof would close the case. Ambiguity keeps it alive. The very fact that science has not been able to end the debate has made the mystery even more compelling for historians, writers, and the public. In a broader sense, the failure of photographs, scars, and DNA to resolve the San Vicente story illustrates the limitations of historical investigation. Not all questions from the past can be answered, even with modern tools. Some remain permanently suspended between fact and legend. Cassidy and Sundance belong in that category. So where does this leave us? After more than a century, the evidence remains contradictory. Two men died in San Vicente in 1908, but their identities were never conclusively established. Bolivian reports claimed they were the famous outlaws. American reports cast doubt. Graves were lost or disturbed. A woman central to their story vanished. The Pinkertons declared victory without proof. A man in the Northwest wrote, as though he were Cassidy himself. And modern science has failed to close the file. The result is a legend that endures precisely because it lacks a final chapter. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid may have died in Bolivia, or they may have returned home under new names. What is certain is that the mystery has outlived them and will likely continue to do so.